Hi there, and welcome to the Sports 2000 podcast. This series takes you behind the scenes of this British sports car prototype series that includes Duratex and Pintos. I'm Sue Stockdale, and I talk to some of the people involved in the Sports 2000 community, giving you an insight into why Sports 2000 is sometimes called motorsport's best kept secret. Well, today's episode is jam-packed with guests, 4 of them to be precise. They are all part of the L'Equipe Rosbif team, who competed in a 24-hour race at Paul Ricard in France in November 2021 in a Sports 2000. The team include Mike Fry, Ross Hyett, Nick Hyett and Chris Snowdon. And I'll be finding out just what it takes to start and finish a race that lasts for 24 hours. Welcome to the podcast. Ross, if I can ask you first, what was the original idea and motivation to compete in this race? And then just tell us a little bit about what it actually involved.
Yeah, well, I suppose when you get to my age, you start to get amnesia about doing the 24-hour races. I've done many of them, but I couldn't remember them. So I thought, well, it didn't seem that bad at the time, so why don't we do it again? And again, Nick started to race with me. I think we mentioned this in the last podcast that I did, which hopefully everybody will listen to get me ahead of Chris. Nick was needing some seat time. So this was really in 2020, pre-COVID. We decided we'd do the 24-hour race. And I've done this sort of professionally, semi-professionally with all sorts of racing drivers. And I've noticed that most of the time we hardly spoke. The end of the race, we hardly ever contacted each other again. And for me, motor racing is about having some fun and doing it with some friends. So I mentioned it to Mike, Chris, to join Nick and I, and thankfully they accepted. And so we got the start of something quite interesting. And last time I did a 24-hour race was 30 years ago. And poor old Nick had heard all the stories many times over. And so this was a chance for him to create a bit of pain for himself. And so we basically set off on a great adventure. My son and some good friends who we'd raced with a couple of seasons with the opportunity to race at a fantastic circuit in France in a series which none of us knew about and we'd not been in before. COVID interfered with it. Our original plans were 2020, so we had to shelve that and then go for 2021. We were determined to get the right car and the right equipment. And to do it, we needed a great engineer, and that was Chris. And so, Chris, I'll hand over to you to say what changes we needed to do compared to a normal Sports 2000 to enable us to go and race in France.
Well, first of all, we had to fit some lights. We had to work out where they needed to go, and there were a number of ways we could have done that. But I chose not to mount them on the nose of the car, because if we lose the nose in the race, then we've lost the lights at night. We didn't have a spare nose, and the cost of the lights was quite costly, so I didn't really want to lose those. So I mounted them on top, which worked out okay, as it turned out at night. And then we had to fit an alternator, which Sports 2000s don't normally have. And I had some various different ideas about how that was going to work. And realistically, the first time we tried it, Nick drove the car at Silverstone with the lights on 2 years ago, just to make sure that they worked and the alternator worked and stuff. And I think he did 10, 15 laps with all the lights on and the alternator on. And that was the test of the lights and the alternator. One of the biggest problems was sort of having to rewire the car. So one of the rules about that V2V have is that they have to have indicators, stoplights, headlights, and all of that sort of stuff. And none of that is on the Sports 2000. So we've now got a Sports 2000 with indicators and headlights and flashing things on the dashboard and an ammeter on the dashboard to tell us that the alternator is charging and all that sort of stuff. Having gone over to France, looking at various different other cars, there were different ways that the French guys had done the alternator and stuff. I've driven this off the drive shaft. I wasn't quite sure whether it was going to last 24 hours. It was held on with 1.5 bolts, the half bolt being just a sort of tensioning bolt. And it stayed there the whole time. It didn't miss a beat. I was really quite impressed with that little modification. The other modification we had to do was to enable us to refuel quickly. And I hadn't allowed for the amount of flow from the fuel pump. And we had a bit of a fueling issue at the beginning of the race, and then we sort of resolved it. But we did lose an awful lot of lap times in the fuel stops, which was a real shame. We also had a smaller fuel tank than the other car that won. And They, I believe, are redressing the rules this year. If we are to go back, they're not going to let us have 80-litre tanks, which is a big help to us because putting an 80-litre tank into a Sports 2000 Tiger is pretty damn impossible. The rest of the preparation, we put new wheel bearings into the car, new brake discs. We started with an awful lot of new bits into the car. We had a fresh engine that had done 0 miles from D'Amico, engine people that do our engines. And I have to say, their engine was really, really reliable. I think we did a total of 27 to 28 hours worth of running over the weekend, and it used about 3/4 of a litre of oil in that time. So we were really pleased with that. That was one of the most reliable things on the car. We managed to get some fairly special seat belts, which instead of pulling down, they pulled up so we could adjust them for each individual driver because we're all different sizes, which makes it for a little bit challenging to fit 4 different sized people into a Sports 2000. We managed it really quite well. Tyres. 2 years ago, I chose some tyres to go on the car, and it turned out that the French guys stole a march on us with that because they had found some other tyres that they had been allowed to use, which the performance of those was superior to ours by some margin. I think we used 4 sets of tyres, which wasn't too bad, and we used 5 sets of brake pads, which I don't think was too bad in 24 hours. When you think we actually did 2 seasons worth of racing in 28 hours, say, it wasn't too bad considering normally we would change the oil 5 or 6 times over a period of 2 years. We didn't change it once. It was a great testament to the engine plus the oils that have moved on. The gearbox was fine. We only changed the gear ratios after testing once. And so we had the same oil in it. The French guys had put oil coolers on, but we didn't. I didn't think it needed it. And having spoken to JP, gearbox specialist at Silverstone, we didn't need to do that. So that was a good plus. So the other thing with preparing the car, it was just going through and making sure that we had lots of good parts. The new throttle cable was on. Rose joints were all checked. I didn't put new stuff on. I made sure it was all in pretty good order before we started, which was good.
And just to pick up on a couple of the points you made, Chris, in terms of the actual car that all of these modifications were being made to, whose car did you start with?
We started with Nick's car, basically, and Ross's. It was a car that Nick had raced for a year, maybe a year and a half before we decided to turn it into the 24-hour car. And then it wasn't actually used. We did one test at Brands Hatch before the last race at Brands GP, just to make sure the tyres worked. And we were so impressed with how the car handled with just the tyres. We only did a couple of laps and we got out the car and thought, well, fantastic, this is great. And little to know that the French were going to come up with another tyre. But, that's another story.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about the thrills and spills of the race in a minute or two. One other question that strikes me as well, Chris, from my experience of learning about Le Mans 24-hour racing is that often the headlamps have got side lights as well, because to be able to see through a corner, to turn in a corner, the lighting, certainly on the high-spec cars that are driving these days in Le Mans, the lights can see down the corner before you get there. What were the types of headlights that you had on this car?
The rules said we were only allowed a pair of headlights. So if you had a saloon car, say, with 4 headlights, they only were allowed to have 2 headlights. So the circuit was lit in some of the areas, which wasn't too bad. But what we'd done is we'd actually crossed the headlights over. So they were sort of pointing a fair way down the track, but also going round corners before they got to the corner, which actually worked very well. It looked a bit odd when the car was going down the straight with the lights pointing at precarious angles, but it actually worked really well.
Sneaky little move there to switch the headlights over there and give you a little bit more vision going around those corners. Mike, if I can come to you to kind of think maybe a little bit more about the team itself and the organisation during the race. For those listeners that haven't been to Paul Ricard, maybe you could just give us a sense of the number of cars that were competing in this 24-hour race overall, and what's the sort of lap times typically that you're doing?
Well, it's a beautiful circuit. I mean, it's very long. I think it's about 3 miles, nestles beneath these mountains. Glorious part of Provence. We didn't see a cloud in the sky, so that undoubtedly helped all of that. I believe there were about 46 starters, a really eclectic mix of some real historic sort of Cobras and Mustangs. There was a Group C car. I mean, it was an amazing number. But a number of people kind of would come along and say, well, I think the Sports 2000 might be the ideal car for this. And that's as it proved, because it was another Sports 2000 that won. And I think out of that 46 or so, from memory, I think about 20 finished, which is pretty good going, because whilst we wanted to place well, anyone with a feel for Le Mans will know that the real thing you want to do is finish. I think all of our nightmare was that we might break down before we'd all done at least one stint, or we'd done a night stint. So the longer it was going on, the dream was just continuing. So as it was getting towards the end, that real ambition fulfilled.
And thinking about then making the plans to work out how you were going to compete, who was going to drive when, and what the changeovers and so on were going to be. Was that your job, Mike, or Nick's, or how did the organisation all work?
No, I think I'd have to spare his blushes, but the fact that Ross had raced at Le Mans, as he said, it was about 2 years in the making. He would say odd things that would kind of start to make perfect sense, but until you really sit down and think what's involved in a 24-hour race, you wouldn't have actually thought of it. So just Ross's experience gave us a huge leg up in terms of what we needed to do. So we weren't complete novices. No, I mean, I think it was a team effort. I think there were about 12 of us in, possibly 14 of us in total. But Ryan, he played an absolute blinder on the pit boards, the pit signals. She was out there for, it must have been 20 hours or something. Shelley and Anchor were huge support in brewing up and keeping us posted on what was happening elsewhere in the race. Because I have to say, Paul Ricard, I mean, the pits are astonishing. I mean, in every pit, you've got a kitchen, a shower, your own toilets. I mean, this is like nothing like anything I'd ever seen. But then again, what Ross had suggested, that we also took over the VIP lounge upstairs, which meant we got proper hot food at different times. There was somewhere where you could get your head down for a bit. So it was those sorts of things that actually made a huge difference. And then in terms of the mechanics, well, Grant Williams was heroic. He did every single fuel stop. And as Chris said, we'd had a problem with the normal fuel, so we got a special dispensation to use the churns. But that's that 20k plus, doing that twice per fill. I mean, it was amazing. And then in terms of my mechanic, Charlie, on the mechanics, my friend Tony, he helped with pit signalling and whole sort of schedule. So you're starting to get the feel for there's a lot of people involved. And it's also makes it sound a bit obvious, but you've got to bear in mind this is 24 hours. So it's not sort of knocking off at 10 o'clock and saying, see you in the morning. You had to keep it going, but also ensure that people were getting some measure of rest. Although I would say, just from my own point of view, I got 2 hours at one stage and woke up feeling worse than I have for many years. Many others just had a bit of a cat nap, and I suspect that might be the best way to avoid getting into a deep sleep.
So to Nick, in terms of the organisation of who drove in what order, can you give us some idea of how that worked?
I don't know whether I can take you through the full 24 hours, Sue, but if I cast my mind back, I think we started the race. I mean, we were all standing there in the garage looking at each other, and I was hoping that one of these great veterans would put the hand up and go first. And luckily enough, Chris started the race. I think I might have gone second, followed by Dad and then Mike. And sure enough, what we tried to do was follow, like Mike suggested, my dad, Ross, his advice in terms of the amount of time that we spend in the car. I think we started with roughly 60 minutes to 90 minutes to see how we felt, how the car got on, and then we'd start to rotate. So we started in that order and tried to keep it throughout the 24-hour period. And then as we started to get a little bit more familiar with the car, with the circuit, with the times that people were doing, fueling, all these tactical kind of elements that, as Mike says, if you haven't done it before and you're not aware of how it is in the moment, you've really got to just live it and experience it together and almost make decisions on the fly. So having the broader team with us, from the mechanics to family members and friends helping out, just to enable you to actually think straight, really, I felt helped us make some decisions. Whether we got it right all the time or not is here nor there, but definitely moving forward, it'll help us. And then towards the end, I think we started to do 90 minutes to almost 120 minutes in the car at any one point in time, particularly through to the morning of the day after. And I just remember my dad saying to me, look, once the sun rises, it's a different game. Then that's when we start kind of putting the pressure on, and let's just see once we get there. So I was on eggshells throughout the whole period thinking, please, let's just get this car through to sunrise. So when I saw the sun coming up, I thought, okay, this could be good. And whether we go into it now or not, but I do remember at one point we were forecast some rain, if the guys remember correctly. And I think we just managed to miss it, but we were getting a little bit worried as to what we might do, whether we come in and put wets on. So you get through this period of 17, 18, 19 hours. And as Mike said, you can kind of feel a bit groggy, good, bad, indifferent. But then all of a sudden the adrenaline comes back and you're a racer again and you're just alive with this energy to go. And it's you're kind of looking at each other going, right, who's in next type thing, you know? So it's quite fascinating. There was some structure, but of course we had to play it by what we saw as well and how everyone was feeling and performing, including the car.
So yeah, adapting in the moment, I imagine, is an important part of being a good team. And Ross, maybe I can ask you particularly about evening time and what is it like driving in the dark?
The thing that a lot of people say about driving in the dark, but actually, if you think about it, we've probably already been we've been testing for 4 hours, maybe 6 hours in total, I think. We'd probably driven 4 hours before we got into the night. So you actually know where the track's going. So anybody who races regularly, by this time, you've got a good idea where it's going anyway. As Chris alluded to, a lot of the corners were lit. So the bottom end of the circuit, the end of the main straight, the chicane on the back straight, and the top corners were lit. So that made a heck of a difference. We had a great set of lights set in a really good position by Chris. So we've got good vision anyway. Again, it's a matter of just relaxing into it. The trick with the 24 hours is not start thinking, I normally do a 30-minute sprint race and I'm knackered at the end of it, which we normally are. Is just get your head into it. It is an endurance and you've just got to drive to a pace that you can do. And that includes the night. And it's always about driving within yourself. Everybody was sick to death of me saying it, but it doesn't matter what speed you're doing. As long as you're driving within yourself and you deliver the car, then whether it's at night or the daytime, it doesn't really matter. Just keep doing it. And everybody, I think, is quite pleased to get through the night session, but they're also quite surprised that it wasn't as bad as they thought it was going to be.
If I could just come in, Sue, just a couple of observations. One is just to pay tribute to Ross, because middle of the night, I think I finished one session about kind of 3 o'clock or something, and I was okay on the track because, as Nick says, lots of adrenaline pumping. Ross then got in and did a double stint at sort of 3 till 5 or something, which was very, very impressive. Yeah, that really took some doing. The other thing I was very surprised about was how quick we could go at night. So when I did my next morning stint, I was getting the pit signals and thinking, well, I've got to get my finger out here. I'm not as fast as I was at night. And actually, I think for 2 of us, our quickest laps were at dead of night. So you just adapt to the conditions and the visibility. All I would say is that I dreaded at night if you had a sudden downpour, because there's so much rubber and oil, it would have been a complete skating rink. But thankfully, we didn't have that because you just wouldn't have the visibility of that.
And just to pick up on the endurance aspect of the physical body that's required here, because obviously you've got to sleep if you can, you've got to have sufficient food, energy to keep going. And then I imagine recovery is really important as well, Mike. How did you plan those things in? And you know, how did you keep yourselves physically refueled with food?
Well, we had some good dietary advice as well, particularly about fluids and the electrolytes. And so we've had both Hyetts were constantly at me. The most common thing they were saying was if you drunk your special super mix or had your gels. So we were doing that. In terms of the food, well, we had all of this hot food coming into the VIP place, but it was all, I wasn't sure about food because at this stage your body really doesn't know what's going on. So it was kind of trying to get something as soon as you'd come in, and then I didn't want to eat immediately before we went out. Have to say, I don't know if it was Chris or Grant had stocked up with a huge sort of industrial quality of white Toblerones on the way over. And I think that kept most of us going as well.
That sounds like it's really important to have. You know, you might be making the listeners think that it's all plain sailing so far, the way you've described it. And I imagine that's perhaps not the case. What happened in the latter stages of the race, Chris, in terms of the mechanical side of things with the car?
Yeah, great. 2 problems we had. Ross was in the car at one time and he'd gone particularly fast. But when he came in, he said the car was handling a little bit odd, but the car seemed to be going quite well. But it seemed to be steering and doing some funny things at the back. And he'd actually done his fastest lap Not quite sure whether we should make this a feature of the Tiger. The car had been steering from the back because unfortunately he'd gone over a sleeping policeman or something and knocked the Tiger's lower cross member is held on with 2 studs. And he'd pulled a stud out of the car. So the car was now steering from the back, which didn't seem to perturb him all that much. And he said, well, it's not good, but it's okay. And then, bless him, Charlie bent underneath the car just as I was getting into the car. And he said, Chris, I think you ought to look at this before you get in. The bottom of the car is not attached. So unfortunately, that was the first fix. That took an hour to do. But it's one of the things I actually really hadn't thought that would actually happen. And I bent under the car and I looked at it and I thought, well, I haven't got the bits for that. And then I bent down on the ground again and I wondered how on earth I was going to do it. And I was thinking, I don't know how to do this. And I actually said this out loud, and it happened to be Bryony, who stood next to me, and she said to me, Dad, just get on and fix it, will you? And so with that comment, it kind of had to be fixed. And then we managed to fix that. Grant and me drilled, we broke the drill that I'd taken, and we managed to drill some stuff and get it all bolted back together again. And that was the longest stop. And the car handled perfectly afterwards and kept on going. And then on my last stint, which was going to be probably, I think, about an hour and 20 minutes, about 10, 15 minutes into the stint, the rear suspension broke, a rose joint snapped out the back of the circuit. And I don't really know why I did it, but I was so determined that we'd got so far into this thing and I was quite buoyed up with it. And I thought the car's still driving, albeit not very well. There's smoke pouring out of the back. There were sparks coming out of the back. And I actually drove it probably 3/4 of a mile on base part of a wheel and a half, and tire rubbed through the bodywork. But we came back in and we found that the rose joint had snapped. And luckily I had one and we fitted that. And then we went to try and start the car, and the car wouldn't start. The starter motor, I thought, had packed up. So we're all pretty tired now. And I said, well, we're going to have to push start this. And fortunately, it managed to catch after the second time. The poor guys they were pushing, and I was doing a bad job at trying to start it, but it actually did start. And we finished the race having repaired the car and not really know why it hadn't started. But when we got back to the workshop and I took the car apart because the engine went away to get checked, and it turned out that the flywheel had been running on the ground all the way from the back of the circuit to the pits. You dread to think what it's done to Paul Ricard, but there you go. And it turned out that the ring gear, which is the part of the starter motor thing runs onto, it was not there. So the flywheel had actually been running on the floor of the thing for the best part of 3/4 of a mile. So we were pretty lucky to get to the end, but it was quite scary when it happened because the car just turned sharp right and was heading towards the wall. And I thought, oh, this is not going to be good. How do I explain this one away? So fortunately, I didn't have to. We got back to the pits and we finished the race. And it was just one of the amazing feelings to have got a little English car to the end with all the group of guys that had been trying so hard to do everything. And we had so much fun and it was ridiculous. Luckily, in the garages, we had television screens in there. And I don't think any of us spent that long looking at television screens with dots going around it. For how many hours we did that for, I have no idea. But it was fascinating to see where all the cars were going round and stuff. It was just great to see. And we had the best time. Yeah.
Despite all of those challenges mechanically that you're describing there, Chris, what was the finishing position for the car overall in the race?
I think we finished 12th, which we were really, really pleased with. We finished third in class, which was another achievement, but 12th overall with the number of problems that we had. I think we spent probably an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 3/4 actually in the garage fixing it with a couple of other little issues. But fortunately, we'd got a truck full of little bits and pieces and we managed to fix everything. Would have been a little bit more of an effort if we'd had to change an engine, but we had an engine, but we didn't need it.
I imagine as you're speaking, Chris, that there's a different sense of fixing a mechanical problem during or at the beginning of a 25-minute sprint race at Brands Hatch or Silverstone. And there's a different thing when a car has been operating at temperature for hours and hours and hours. Is it not really hot then to change any of those components and work on the car?
It's quite hot. Fortunately, we've never been into garages like it. They were centrally heated. So it was very pleasant in the garage, good lighting. And when we were fixing the car, Ross did his best to supply us with drinks and food and encouragement. Likewise did Nick and the girls and everybody. It was just a complete team effort. It was fantastic, really. And it's what I think a lot of motor racing is missing, the fun of doing it in this way.
I can really get a sense of the team effort and the enjoyment that it brought for you all to be pulling together and working in this way to finish and have an achievement. Nick, what do you think was the appeal of the event for you? As you look back now, what are the highlights that stick in your mind about the whole experience?
There's so many. I mean, from a very personal perspective, I mean, my dad's alluded to it already. From his point of view of racing with his son, with me, and likewise, I've grown up watching or listening to the stories of my dad racing and hearing about Le Mans, and kind of never ever thought that this would be something that I would do. I've played many other sports in the past, and this kind of is just beyond anything that I imagined. So the guys were talking about what it was like to drive in the nighttime, and that for me was just a complete fantasy of what it could be like and what the experience would be like. And it was incredible. When the lights go and you're just there on the track, it's such a surreal experience just to be there and to learn how the track moves, the undulations through the light and the different lines that you can take. And it's that camaraderie. It's not a lonely space by any means, racing, but you are there on the start-finish straight at the start of the race trying to win for yourself in a way, and for the people who are backing you and are in the pits perhaps. And there are moments where you don't kind of talk, you don't share stories, but this was the complete opposite. It was a real team spirit, and it was amazing, I found, being able to stand in the garage, all of us huddled around screens or huddled around whiteboards, pointing at these little black lines on this board saying, oh, what did you do on this corner and how did you take it? And, what gear were you in? And all these things. And you just kind of stand back and go, this is crazy. This is not an everyday occurrence by any stretch. Yeah, it's just truly, truly fascinating and a real privilege to be able to do. So for me, it was being part of a team again, being with my dad, having that experience, standing there, regardless of being on the podium or not. I mean, I just remember standing on the fence with everybody, if everyone recalls, after that debacle of the car coming in on a wheel and a half. I think myself and my dad were sitting upstairs having the final plate of pasta that we could possibly find. we dropped it and ran like you can't imagine down the stairs. I might have gone back and had another bite before I went down, but we ran downstairs. Everyone was just like looking around. I think even the people who were sharing the garage stood back. And as Chris alluded to, my dad and myself, we were there with the water because we're not the best mechanics in the world. Chris got the car out, and when he came round for the final lap, it was just a pure joy. Everyone stood on that fence, and it was that moment that you see on TV. You see everyone standing there cheering, whatever discipline it be in motorsport. And it was just awesome. And I've got this incredible photo that someone's taken, and the smiles on everyone's face. I just look at it with the fondest of memories. So if there's a chance to do it again or anything like it, yeah, count me in. It was just awesome. It was fantastic.
It does just sound amazing. And just to you, Ross, you talked about bringing this idea, putting it into practice in the first place, perhaps buoyed by your previous experience of endurance racing. Did this live up to the reality that you were hoping it would be?
Better, really, in so many levels. We were there living literally cheek by jowl. We all stayed in the same house. We literally lived with each other 24/7. I don't remember a cross word in 4 days. There was huge stress. There was huge tension. Poor Chris, when I brought the car in, he was like middle of the night, tired, but not a crossword, just got stuck in, made the thing happen. Grant was absolutely exhausted, never complained once. Everybody was amazing. Tony put in hours shifts with Briley on the pit wall. Everybody came together as a great team, and it was a real privilege to be part of it. So it was one of those experiences where on many levels it is so good that we've got to go back and have another crack at it, using better tyres, because we were definitely hoodwinked on that, because the tyres that they said we could use were not on the list that all the French were using. But hey, these things happen. It gives us a challenge for next time. And I couldn't think of a better group of people to go and have another go at it.
What was the appeal of the event for you, Mike? Your reflections now, having completed it, what would you say?
I hadn't quite realised what a French institution it was. Apparently it hadn't been run for several years, but amongst the French motor racing fraternity, this is a big deal. So being overseas, were two British teams. There's a buzz there. I have to say, everybody was incredibly hospitable. It was a brilliant way of extending our season, entering the unknown. I was a bit apprehensive going into it, didn't know what would be involved, how physically enduring it will be. But I particularly remember going into one of the night stints, and I was stood on the pit apron, suited and booted, and waiting for the car to come in. And it just took me back to all the Le Mans races I've been and witnessed. And I remember watching cars with headlights in the middle of the night, beautiful sort of starry night, just thinking, wow, this is real motor racing. So it was a kind of evocation of, everything. It's kind of like the first time you ever do a race. For me, that's kind of, I don't know, 30 odd years ago. It was the same sort of buzz. But this time, as the others have said, we're a great bunch of people where you could share stories. Oh, did that Corvette cut you up as well? Or what on earth is that Porsche driver doing? Or all of that stuff. And it was also overcoming adversity because, as Chris said, we had a few alarming points where we were all kind of getting stuck in, but secretly thinking, oh, God, is this it? Is this the end of the dream? But so then to overcome it was something special. So we got home back on the Sunday night and we could tuck into some pastrons, some wine, but within 5 minutes of the last plate being cleared, everybody completely flaked out. So I think that's what it was about. Yeah, think of an SRCC overseas trip plus, just to give some of those who might be listening to this a flavour of how great it was.
So maybe my final question would be to you, Chris. Maybe I shouldn't even ask this if any of the listeners are perhaps planning to do the race themselves in the future, but what, if anything, would you want to do differently next time if you're competing again in this race?
One of the biggest things we'd need to change is the fueling side of things on the car, which is not easy, but something that would definitely help us move further up the thing because we did lose a lot of laps refueling. A couple of little issues with the car that can be resolved, which are being done. Tyres, there's an awful lot that I would have done differently. I think I might not have driven back all the way on the Monday, I think it was, all the way back to Dieppe in one hit to find the ferry had gone. But I think I'd take a little bit more notice of the timing of everything. But I think we'd have to have a pool just to make sure that there were things that we haven't really discussed what we needed to do differently. But I think from the first go, we were pretty good. One of the things that we do need, and Nick, hopefully Anchor will come next time, because we do need a French speaker. One little story I just need to finish off on. Bryony was elected to be team manager. French is not her strong point, but we did get pulled up to the clerk of the course. And fortunately, he went along because she was a team manager. And then I went along to support Bryony. And then I said to Anchor, please come. And luckily she did, because I've never seen a race control like they have at Paul Ricard. It's like the NASA control room. It's just unbelievably large with all these people in there. And the clerk of the course comes up to us and shows us a picture on his phone. And he says, is this acceptable? In French. But luckily Anchor, with her smile and Bryony's smile, I think managed to say we could carry on. But if we'd done anything else wrong, we were gone. They were really, really strict over there. So fortunately, Anchor did save the day that day.
It sounds like for any of the listeners, maybe they want to get a step ahead of if they're planning to compete. If they get a French speaker, then that will be one advantage that they will have.
Sue, if I could just say, all joking apart, anybody who wants to come and join us, let's make it roast beef. Let's make it 3 cars or 4 cars. Let's end the season brilliantly. November, it's the end of the season. What a great way to finish it. And we'll share anything that we've got. Everybody knows Chris. He's the most generous person of both his time and his knowledge. We'd encourage as many people to come and join in and have some fun in a truly great event that they do very, very well, I have to say. It's a privilege to be able to race there. So anybody who'd love to join us, let us know.
Well, it's been a real privilege to speak to you all today and to hear about this amazing experience that you've had. And I look forward to perhaps hearing more of your successes once you've competed in this again. Thanks very much, gents, for your time.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue.
Yes, Sue.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this bumper episode and hearing about the 24-hour race. Please help us to spread the word. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. And remember to tell your friends about us too. You can connect with us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And the links will all be in the show notes. Next time, I'll be speaking to Nick Bailey, another Sports 2000 driver, so I do hope you can join me then.